Most people believe peace arrives when life finally becomes quiet, when problems settle and uncertainty fades. But what if peace has been there all along, gently waiting beneath the noise we keep trying to solve? There's a strange comfort in overthinking. It makes us feel busy, responsible, prepared, yet it quietly steals the rest we're searching for. If you've ever wished for just one evening where your mind would loosen its grip and let you breathe, you're not alone. This is the story of someone who discovered that silence doesn't come from controlling every thought, but from learning which ones don't need an answer. On some nights, when the house finally fell quiet, his mind seemed to grow louder, as if it had been waiting all day for the chance. Thoughts paced the floor like restless visitors who had missed the last train home. He replayed small moments, a careless word, a strange look, an opportunity he didn't take, until they swelled into something heavier than they were. Even in the soft dark, he couldn't shake the sense that he was still on duty, still required to solve everything before morning. It made him wonder, with a tired sort of curiosity, whether silence was something other people simply knew how to find. He had a habit of reaching for the old radio on his bedside table, a dusty thing that never quite tuned properly. It crackled with overlapping stations, voices talking over one another, music dissolving into static. Somehow, it matched the feeling inside his chest, so he let it murmur as if it kept him company. When he tried to adjust the dial, the noise only sharpened, a sharp hiss filling the small room. He would sigh, half amused, half defeated, and let it chatter on like an anxious friend who didn't know when to stop. During the day, the noise followed him in quieter disguises. While washing a cup, he'd suddenly relive an old embarrassment, cheeks warming, as if it were happening again. Standing in line at a shop, he'd imagine futures collapsing before they had even begun. It was exhausting, carrying conversations that hadn't happened and arguments no one else could hear. Sometimes he caught himself wishing for a switch, just a small one, that could dim it all for a while. Once, after a particularly long afternoon, he pressed his palm gently against the radio's speaker. For a second, the sound softened, muffled by the warmth of his hand. In that brief hush, something inside him loosened, like a knot remembering it didn't have to stay tight. He held still, barely breathing, afraid the quiet might slip away if he moved too quickly. It left him with a strange question he couldn't quite phrase, only feel. What would his mind sound like, he wondered, if it finally stopped reaching for every signal at once? Would there be emptiness, or something softer waiting underneath the static? The thought lingered with him as he lay back, eyes open to the dim ceiling. Somewhere between the fading noise and the coming sleep, he sensed there might be another way to listen. He didn't know yet that this small curiosity was already turning the dial toward something new. In the days that followed, he began noticing how quickly he treated every thought like an urgent knock at the door. A memory would appear, and he'd rush to answer it, as if silence might be rude. An imagined future would call his name, and he'd chase it down the hallway of his mind. It never occurred to him that some thoughts were only passing travelers, not guests meant to stay. The radio, faithful to its chaos, kept talking over these realizations, with its usual restless murmur. One morning, too tired to adjust the dial, he simply let it play while he sat beside it. Without his constant fiddling, the noise didn't grow quieter, but it stopped feeling personal. It was just sound, scattered, indifferent, almost harmless when he didn't lean into it. He watched the dust float through the thin light, rising and falling without needing permission. Something about that gentle drifting made his chest feel a little less crowded. He began to suspect that the peace he wanted wasn't something he had to build from scratch. Maybe it was already there, tucked beneath the layers of mental chatter like a calm lake under wind. Trying to force quiet had only tightened the storm, like gripping a tangled string and pulling harder. But when he loosened his hold, even for a breath, the tension eased on its own. It was a small discovery, fragile as a soap bubble, yet oddly reassuring. That evening, he experimented in the simplest way he could think of. When a sharp memory surfaced, he didn't argue with it or explain it away. He just noticed it, the way one might notice a passing car from a window. It felt awkward at first, like standing still on a moving walkway. The radio crackled on, but for once it didn't seem to demand an answer. A quiet idea settled beside him then, gentle as a hand on his shoulder. Silence, he realized, wasn't something you wrestled into place. It arrived when you stopped wrestling. The thought surprised him enough to make him laugh under his breath, a soft, disbelieving sound. If that were true, It meant he had been exhausting himself, chasing something that never ran away. And somewhere in that realization, the story of how he learned this was already beginning to unfold. He had always been known as the careful one, the man who could spot every possible outcome before taking a step. Friends once admired it, saying he was thoughtful, wise even, though lately their voices carried a hint of concern. Simple choices, which message to send, whether to accept an invitation, what tone to use, could stall him for hours. He would sit with his phone in hand, thumb hovering, as if a wrong word might tilt the world slightly off balance. Meanwhile, life kept moving, doors swinging open and shut while he remained in the hallway thinking. Opportunities slipped past in quiet ways, almost polite about it. A chance to travel, a new friendship, even a small moment of joy, all postponed until he felt certain enough. But certainty never arrived. It only multiplied into more questions, more imagined consequences. He told himself he was being responsible, though deep down he sensed it was fear wearing a tidy disguise. The radio on his table buzzed louder on those days, as if echoing the tension he wouldn't name. Mistakes haunted him more than they should have, replaying like stubborn echoes in an empty room. A careless comment from years ago could still flush his face with heat while he brushed his teeth. Sometimes he whispered apologies to no one in particular, unsure who he was trying to comfort. It left him carrying a quiet shame, the kind that hides behind polite smiles. Even laughter felt cautious, as though joy might lead to regret if he wasn't vigilant. Late at night, he would lean forward and stare at the radio's trembling dial. He kept believing that if he found the exact position, the perfect balance, the noise would finally resolve. Instead, the sound fractured further, voices dissolving into sharp static that prickled against his skin. It mirrored the way his thoughts multiplied whenever he tried to solve them all at once. Still, he couldn't stop adjusting, as if control itself might soothe him. Underneath it all lived a quiet fear he rarely admitted, even to himself. What if he made the wrong choice and confirmed every doubt he carried? What if one misstep proved he was as uncertain as he secretly felt? These questions circled him like unseen birds, never landing, never leaving. And it was during one of these restless evenings that someone unexpected noticed him listening to the noise. The radio had become more than an object. It was almost a companion that refused to sleep. Its dial trembled as though it, too, were nervous about settling anywhere for long. Whenever he tried to focus on one clear station, the sound would splinter into overlapping fragments. A cheerful melody would collide with urgent voices, dissolving into a restless electric fog. He sometimes wondered if the machine carried all the unfinished thoughts he couldn't hold alone. On difficult afternoons, he would turn the knob back and forth, chasing a clarity that slipped away the moment he reached for it. The more he tried, the sharper the static became, like a warning he couldn't translate. It filled the room with a pressure that made his shoulders rise without him noticing. Even the air seemed to hum, as though the noise had weight. He'd step back eventually, rubbing his temples, unsure why he felt so tired from simply listening. There were moments when the radio startled him with sudden bursts of volume, voices shouting from nowhere. His heart would jump, reacting before he had time to remind himself it was only sound. It was strangely similar to the way criticism or a harsh memory could surge through him without invitation. A careless remark from someone at the market could echo for hours, louder than it deserved. The radio, unbothered, kept broadcasting its storm as if it knew no other way. One evening, after trying to plan too many things at once, he switched it off in frustration. The silence that followed felt thick, almost suspicious, as if the noise were waiting just outside the door. For a few breaths, he didn't know what to do with the sudden stillness. His hands hovered awkwardly in the quiet, missing the familiar distraction. Then, with a reluctant motion, he turned the radio back on, comforted by the chaos he claimed to dislike. It dawned on him, though he didn't say it aloud, that the sound had become a reminder of how crowded his inner world felt. As long as it played, he didn't have to face the emptiness he feared might be underneath. Yet something in him was growing curious about that emptiness, the way one might eye a closed door at the end of a hallway. He caught himself glancing toward it even when the noise was loudest, and not far from that quiet door, someone patient was already waiting for him to notice. It happened on a gray afternoon when the sky seemed undecided about rain. He carried the radio to a small repair shop at the edge of his neighborhood, more out of habit than hope. A bell chimed softly as he stepped inside, though no one rushed to greet him. Behind the counter sat an older woman, hands folded, as if she had been listening to something long before he arrived. Her calm felt unusual, like a quiet room in the middle of a crowded station. He began explaining the problem in a rush, apologizing for talking too much even as he continued. She didn't interrupt, didn't nod impatiently, didn't reach for the radio right away. She simply listened, her attention steady and unhurried, which made his words slow on their own. By the time he stopped, the shop felt softer, as though the air itself had settled. It startled him how relieving it was to be heard without being fixed. When she finally touched the radio, her movements were gentle, almost affectionate. She turned the dial once, then let her hand rest there without forcing it further. The static eased slightly, not into music, but into a quieter kind of noise. Machines, she said with a small smile, sometimes just need someone who isn't trying to hurry them. He wasn't sure whether she meant the radio or something else entirely. He lingered longer than necessary, drawn by the peaceful rhythm of the place. There was a chair by the window, and she motioned for him to sit as if it had always been his. They watched the slow drift of people passing outside, neither of them filling the silence. At first, he felt the urge to speak, to explain himself again, to prove he was worth the attention. But her quiet presence made it seem unnecessary, even a little funny. For the first time in a while, the noise inside him didn't feel like the only thing in the room. He noticed the faint ticking of a clock, the soft brush of wind against the glass. Silence, he realized, wasn't empty here. It was spacious, almost welcoming. He found himself wondering how she had learned to sit so comfortably inside it, and as if she sensed the question forming, she looked at him with a knowing warmth that suggested an answer was coming. Many of the stories you hear here aren't just stories. They reflect the invisible weight you may be carrying every day. If you're tired of holding pain, responsibility, and guilt that were never yours, I created an ebook called The Weight of Stones That Are Not Yours and More Too Bonus for You. It's for those who want to let go, set boundaries, and live with more lightness. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment. She adjusted her glasses and studied the radio for a quiet moment, as though listening beneath the sound. Most people think the problem is the noise, she said gently, but it's often the chasing. He frowned a little, unsure whether to feel puzzled or relieved. Her finger rested lightly on the dial, not turning it, just feeling its faint vibration. When you stop running after every signal, she added, some of them stop running after you. To show him, she stepped back from the counter and invited him to stand where she had been. The radio continued its restless chatter, but from a small distance it felt less intrusive. Notice, she whispered, as if they were observing something fragile, how it changes when you don't lean in. He did notice. The sound hadn't softened, yet it no longer pressed against his chest. It was simply there, like rain on a roof you don't have to fix. She told him thoughts behaved much the same way, though she said it without the weight of instruction. Watch them, she said, tapping the counter lightly, but don't follow them down the street. The image made him smile despite himself, picturing his worries marching off without him. He realized how often he had chased them until he forgot where he'd started. Standing still felt strange, like learning a new kind of balance. For a minute they listened together without touching the radio at all. He tried noticing the sound the way he might notice wind through leaves, present but not demanding. A tightness he hadn't been aware of began to loosen behind his ribs. It startled him enough that he glanced at her, half expecting instructions to keep it that way. She only nodded, as if to say he had already understood more than he thought. Peace isn't hiding from you, she said finally, her voice warm but matter-of-fact. It's just waiting for you to stop arguing with the noise long enough to hear it. The words settled into him slowly, like seeds finding the right depth in soil. He didn't feel transformed, only curious in a quieter, steadier way. And as he left the shop with the radio cradled in his arms, he sensed this wasn't something to solve. It was something to practice. He didn't change overnight, which was oddly comforting. The radio still crackled each morning, greeting him with its familiar confusion of signals. But now, instead of rushing to fix it, he sometimes left it playing while he made tea. He would stand there, hands wrapped around the warm cup, simply noticing the noise without answering it. It felt awkward at first, like wearing a new pair of shoes that hadn't softened yet. Thoughts still came in waves, especially when something stung. A sharp comment, a delayed reply, a memory that surfaced uninvited. His instinct was to dive in and untangle them, to prove he could restore order. Instead, he tried what she had shown him, watching, breathing once, letting the wave pass. Some days he managed only a few seconds before getting pulled under again. Even so, those brief moments left a faint trail of calm behind them. There were uncomfortable stretches when the silence felt too wide, almost suspicious. His mind searched for something to fill it, like a radio scanning desperately for a station. He caught himself reaching for distractions, unnecessary worries, old regrets, imagined conversations. When he noticed this, he would pause and press his palm lightly against the radio's surface. The small gesture reminded him he didn't have to tune anything right now. Gradually, the quiet moments grew longer, slipping into his day without announcement. While walking home one evening, he realized he had gone several blocks without rehearsing the past or predicting the future. The world around him seemed oddly vivid, the sound of footsteps, the gold edge of sunset on windows. He almost laughed, surprised by how ordinary peace felt when it finally arrived. It wasn't dramatic at all, just spacious, like a room he had forgotten he owned. He still had restless nights, of course, and mornings when the noise returned with enthusiasm. But now he knew he didn't have to wrestle it into silence to move forward. Sometimes he would sit beside the radio, listening as if it were a distant storm passing over another town. The tension that once drove him softened into something like patience, and soon life would offer him a moment that quietly tested whether this new way of listening could hold. The moment arrived on an ordinary afternoon, disguised as a simple decision he would once have postponed for days. A message blinked on his phone, an invitation that carried the faint risk of disappointment. He felt the familiar stir of analysis beginning, like the radio warming up before a storm of static. Old questions lined up, ready to argue for caution, for delay, for perfect certainty. For a second, he almost let them take over, the way he always had. Instead, he set the phone down and rested his hand on the radio's quiet surface. He didn't switch it on, didn't adjust the dial, just felt the cool metal under his palm. One slow breath came, then another, as if he were listening for a softer frequency inside himself. The urgency loosened its grip, not disappearing but no longer steering. It was the first time a choice felt like a doorway instead of a test. He picked up the phone again and read the message without rehearsing possible outcomes. No imaginary arguments, no predicting embarrassment, no trying to control what hadn't happened. A simple clarity settled in, gentle but steady, like knowing which path leads home at dusk. He typed his reply in a few quiet seconds and pressed send before doubt could gather. The ease of it surprised him enough to make him smile at the empty room. Later, whatever followed, whether the meeting went well or awkwardly, didn't echo the way it once would have. He noticed disappointment come and go like a passing cloud, leaving the sky mostly intact. There was relief in realizing he didn't have to analyze every ripple to trust the water. The radio remained silent that evening, not because it was fixed, but because it didn't need to speak. He understood then that certainty wasn't something he had to manufacture. It appeared when the noise stepped aside. As night settled, he sat by the window, aware of a quiet confidence he hadn't known before. It wasn't loud or triumphant, just a steady warmth that stayed even when questions hovered nearby. He wondered how many other moments in life might open this way if he kept listening inward first. The thought didn't pressure him. It simply waited, patient as a lamp left on in another room. And somewhere in that calm, he sensed there was a simple way others might learn to hear it too. If someone had been sitting across from him that night, they might have noticed how quietly he closed his eyes. It wasn't dramatic, just a small pause, like stepping out of a crowded room for fresh air. He listened first to the faint hum of the city beyond the window, then to the softer sounds inside the room. The radio remained off, yet its presence felt steady, like a reminder rather than a problem. For a moment, he simply let the world speak without needing to translate it. A thought tried to interrupt, something about tomorrow, something unfinished, but he didn't chase it. He imagined it drifting past like a train he wasn't required to board. Another breath came, slow and unforced, the kind that settles the shoulders on its own. In that brief space, he sensed how much energy he used labeling every sound, every feeling. Without the labels, everything softened into a quiet background. He placed his hand lightly over his chest, not as a technique, but as a gentle anchor. The steady rhythm beneath his palm reminded him that something inside him already knew how to be calm. For 60 seconds he stayed there, listening as if he were tuning to a station that didn't broadcast in words. The silence felt full, not empty, like a pause in music that makes the next note clearer. When he opened his eyes, the room looked exactly the same, yet something inside him had shifted. He wondered, with a quiet kind of hope, how many others carried the same restless noise without knowing a door existed. How often people filled every gap with distraction because stillness felt unfamiliar. If he could have spoken to them, he might have suggested this small experiment. Nothing elaborate. Just closing the eyes for a minute, letting sounds arrive and leave without commentary. It was so simple it almost felt like a secret people overlooked. The radio stayed silent as he prepared for sleep, its dial catching a faint glimmer of lamplight. He realized he no longer needed it to mirror his thoughts. It could simply be an object again. Outside, the night carried its own quiet rhythm, steady and unhurried. He lay down with the sense that the calm he had touched was not fragile after all. And somewhere between waking and dreaming, a deeper understanding began to take shape. By morning, the room held a stillness that felt different from the silence he used to fear. It wasn't the uneasy kind that waits for noise to return, but something steady and settled. Sunlight rested on the radio's surface, turning its scratches into thin lines of gold. He noticed he hadn't reached for the dial in days, not out of discipline but lack of urgency. The quiet had not been created. It had simply been uncovered. He sat beside the window and listened, not for answers, just for the shape of the moment. Birdsong drifted in, ordinary and unremarkable, yet it felt clearer than any signal the radio had chased. For the first time he understood that peace had been present even on the loudest nights. It had waited patiently beneath the static, like a melody playing too softly to notice. All it had asked was that he stop trying to outshout the noise. There were still thoughts, of course, rising and fading like waves on a calm shore, but now they moved through him instead of piling up around him. He could watch them the way one watches clouds change shape without needing to interpret each one. A quiet confidence grew from that simple permission to let things pass. It felt less like gaining control and more like remembering something he'd always known. He touched the radio once more before leaving the room, almost fondly. It no longer represented chaos, only a chapter he had walked through slowly. In its silence, he sensed the wisdom he had been searching for had never come from outside. It had been there all along, waiting for space to be heard. The realization didn't arrive like a revelation, just a gentle settling into place. As he stepped into the day, the world sounded spacious rather than overwhelming. Voices, footsteps, distant traffic, all part of a larger quiet he carried within him. He understood now that serenity wasn't the absence of sound, but the absence of struggle against it. The peace he had chased across so many restless nights walked beside him effortlessly, and in that fullness of silence, he finally felt at home.